Welcome back. Join us as we uncover the chilling stories of 5 of the most notorious and evil serial killers in history. From their gruesome crimes to the disturbing psychology behind their actions, each case is a haunting exploration of the darkest facets of humanity. Dive deep into the minds of these infamous individuals and learn about the horrifying legacies they left behind. Subscribe for more true crime content and hit the bell icon never to miss an update on the most shocking cases in history. Wineville, California was once a quiet, pastoral area where parents could raise their children in peace, far away from larger cities where crime ran rampant. That all changed in 1926 when a Canadian transplant swept into the community and devastated everything and everyone in his path. 18-year-old Gordon Northcott and his family had relocated to Los Angeles from British Columbia in 1924. Longing for seclusion, it had been the teenager who had convinced his father to purchase property an hour away in Wineville. After finding the perfect piece of land, the men of the family had rolled up their sleeves and constructed a poultry farm from the ground up. When the endeavor proved more taxing than they had anticipated, Gordon sent word to his nephew in Canada that his services were needed. Sanford Clark, who was only 13 at the time, had packed a bag and headed to Wineville with the intention of working as a farmhand. Shortly after his arrival, the boy learned that his uncle had other ideas that were not at all what he had expected. In the coming months, Sanford was repeatedly physically and sexually abused by Northcott. He eventually became so beaten down that he no longer possessed a will of his own. Although Northcott's father Cyrus resided at the farm, he would later deny having any knowledge of his son's activities regarding Sanford or any of the other victims yet to be named. His wife Sarah, who preferred the amenities of city life, divided her time between the rural property and an apartment she kept in Los Angeles. Back in Canada, Sanford's mother Winifred was growing increasingly worried about her son. The letters he was sending home, which were few and far between, led her to conclude that all was not right on the chicken farm. She was so concerned, in fact, that she reached out to authorities in the United States, explaining to them that she had reason to believe that her son was in grave danger. Rather than taking swift action, they had listened politely and assured her that they would look into the matter when time allowed. Appalled by law enforcement's lack of concern for Sanford, his 19-year-old sister Jessie headed to Wineville to check on her kid brother's well-being. Though she found him alive and seemingly well, she would soon learn that he was keeping a dark secret that was far worse than anything she, or anyone else, had imagined. Sanford told his sister that their uncle had been subjecting him to a multitude of indescribable tortures ever since his arrival. He explained that he had wanted to leave but feared what would happen if he tried to escape and failed. He knew better than anyone what Northcott was capable of and didn't want the cruelty unleashed on him. Tiring of the vague references, Jessie prodded her brother until he broke down and shared the depths of their uncle's depravity. According to Sanford, besides being an abusive bully, he was also a murderer of children. He knew this because he had helped bury the bodies of 4 boys under the dirt floor of the chicken coop. Jessie could tell by her siblings' demeanor that he was deadly serious. She didn't know how to handle the scary situation, but she did know that they had to get out of Wineville as soon as possible. In a bold move, she had confronted Northcott about his mistreatment of her brother. Rather than being shamed by the accusation, he had lashed out at his niece in a temper. After seeing how quickly he had resorted to violence, Jessie fled home to Canada. Before her departure, she had promised Sanford that she would be back, and the next time, she wouldn't come alone. When she was safely back in Canada, Jessie went to the U.S. consulate and related everything her brother had told her about their uncle's criminal activities. With these serious allegations before them, the consul wasted no time informing the Los Angeles Police Department of the alleged murders in Wineville. A few weeks later, on a balmy day in August of 1928, 2 immigration officers showed up at the farm to investigate Jessie's claims. Unbeknownst to them, Northcott had seen them coming and had taken off running out the back door. Before fleeing into the nearby woods, he had ordered Sanford to keep the authorities occupied while he made his getaway. He warned the boy that if they caught up to him, he would circle back and shoot him before the cops knew what was happening. Knowing that his uncle meant business, Sanford did as he was told and ran out to greet the agents. Though he tried his best to distract them, they were there for a reason and weren't about to let a skinny kid keep them from the task at hand. Since they didn't need Northcott's permission to search the property, they headed for the chicken coop where they had been informed the bodies were interred. Once there, they found one gruesome piece of evidence after another. In plain view were blood-stained axes with hair, which appeared to be human, clinging to the blades. An assortment of Boy Scout badges and a toy whistle was also discovered, as was a tattered book with a library card attached that bore the borrower's name. Investigators would soon learn that the boy in question, Nelson Winslow, had been reported missing 3 months earlier. After realizing that his uncle was no longer in control, Sanford showed authorities exactly where the remains were buried. Sure enough, at his direction, 3 shallow graves were uncovered. When all was said and done, 51 human body parts were collected from the earth beneath the chicken coop. Upon further inspection, it became apparent that someone had disturbed the grave sites before their discovery. The experienced excavators knew that the bones they were finding were only a fraction of what should have been there. This led them to conclude that the bodies had been moved in an attempt to avoid detection. Fortunately for those working the case, the perpetrators had been in such a hurry that they had left just enough evidence behind to hang themselves. While the farm in Wineville was being processed as a crime scene, Gordon Northcott was hiding out at his mother Sarah's residence in Los Angeles. When he had shown up on her doorstep complaining that the law was after him, she had dropped everything and made arrangements for them to return to Canada. This was no surprise given that she had always lived by the words, "I would do anything for Gordon." 3 weeks later, mother and son were arrested in British Columbia. Even so, it would be 2 long years before they would be extradited to California to stand trial for the murders that had occurred on the farm in Wineville. Upon being confronted with the mountain of evidence against them, Sarah admitted to having murdered 9-year-old Walter Collins. She had taken full responsibility for the heinous act, stating that she had willingly participated in killing the boy without any prompting from her son. Her confession had made it painfully clear that the rotten acorn hadn't fallen far from the tree. She elaborated by saying that Gordon had always cautioned her to steer clear of the chicken coop. Her curiosity getting the better of her, she had snuck out to the shed one day in the spring of 1928 when her son was away. In one of the coops, she had been surprised to find a filthy little boy, frightened out of his wits. When she confronted her son about what she had seen, he had casually explained that he had abducted the boy a few days earlier. Sarah, who was always looking out for her son's best interests, informed him that he would have to kill the child since he had seen his face and could therefore identify him. Later that evening, Sarah, Gordon, and Sanford had descended on the chicken coop. Once there, they had taken turns striking the helpless boy with the blunt end of an axe as he slept. When they were sure that he was dead, Sarah had buried him beside the coop where he had been held prisoner for nearly a week. Walter Collins' story was as sad and convoluted a tale as most people had ever heard. The lad had been reported missing by his mother Christine in March of 1928. She recalled that she had given him money to go to the cinema before leaving for work. When she returned home later that day, he was nowhere to be found. When word of the boy's disappearance spread, witnesses came forward to say that they had seen him walking to the theater that afternoon. Somewhere along the way, someone had grabbed him off the street without anyone being the wiser. Once his abductor had him alone, Walter's fate was sealed. Suspicion instantly turned to Walter's father, a career criminal who was serving time in Folsom State Prison when his son went missing. Christine had a hunch that perhaps one of her ex-husband's many enemies had taken her child in retaliation for a wrong committed by his father. Young Walter's disappearance made the national news, which put pressure on the Los Angeles Police Department to hurry up and solve the case. 5 months after the boy was last seen, detectives announced that he had turned up safe and sound thousands of miles away in Illinois. As one would imagine, Christine was overjoyed to learn that the son she thought she'd lost forever had been found alive. Without hesitation, she had paid his train fare home. His arrival was a media spectacle. News agencies from far and wide were in attendance to cover the joyful reunion. Everyone waited with bated breath for the moment when the devoted mother would once again hold her child in her arms. When he stepped off the train to cheers and applause, Christine's heart sank. She would have known Walter in a crowd of thousands, and this gangly kid was not her son. As people clamored to take pictures of the happy twosome, Christine refused their requests to pose with the boy who was a stranger to her. Rather than entertain the folly, she had gone in search of Captain J.J. Jones, the man in charge of Walter's case. When she found him, she explained that there had been a terrible mix-up. She insisted that, while the boy may very well have been someone's missing child, it certainly wasn't hers. Instead of putting an end to the fiasco then and there, Jones had argued that she was mistaken. He assured her that she was simply overwhelmed by the commotion. His advice was to take her son home, and stop being ungrateful. Caught between a rock and a hard place, she did as she was told. Things only got worse from there. The more time she spent with the stranger who claimed to be her child, the more apparent it was that he wasn't Walter. To back up her claims, she had obtained copies of her son's dental records, which ruled out any possibility that the boy in her care was Walter. Armed with this irrefutable evidence, she paid a visit to the police station. Even after seeing that the boy's teeth did not match Walter's, Captain Jones maintained his position that he had done his job, and the case was now closed. When Christine protested that her son was still out there somewhere, the man she had thought was on her side had her arrested and taken to the psych ward for evaluation. To satisfy his ego, Jones had a handwriting expert compare known examples of Walter's script with that of the boy from Illinois. To his dismay, they didn't match. He then brought the changeling in for an interview. When faced with proof of his lies, the child had quickly spilled the truth. Just as Christine had known all along, his name wasn't Walter Collins, it was Arthur Hutchins. As it turned out, Arthur was 12 years old, whereas Walter was only 9. A runaway, he had lived with his stepmother for a time before adopting the life of a drifter. When he happened to see the story of Walter's disappearance on the local news, he decided to try his hand at assuming the missing boy's identity. A fan of cowboy movies, he had always wanted to travel to Hollywood. He hoped that if the scheme worked, he could somehow meet his hero, Tom Mix. After the embarrassing debacle was exposed, Arthur was sent back to Illinois to live with his stepmother, Violet. Even though he had caused Christine Collins untold heartache, he had shown no remorse for his thoughtless actions. Rather than being ashamed of his behavior, he had reveled in the attention, however short-lived. Later on, when Christine learned that Walter's name had come up during the investigation of the murders in Wineville, she reached out to Northcott as he sat in prison awaiting trial, hoping to find out what had happened to her son. True to form, he couldn't do the right thing, even when it involved a grieving mother in desperate need of closure. In some of their communications, Northcott would admit to having abducted and murdered Walter. In others, he would deny that he had ever seen the boy. He seemed to take great pleasure in teasing Christine with details, only to turn around and pretend to have no knowledge of the accusations against him. In the end, she would go to her grave still holding out hope that her son, whose remains were never found, was alive somewhere, waiting to be rescued. Though Walter Collins' abduction had made headlines, he wasn't the only one whose life's journey had ended at the Wineville home of Gordon Northcott. According to Sanford, his uncle had abducted and killed other boys in the months before he had taken a flight to Canada. Among the known victims were Nelson and Louis Winslow, ages 10 and 12 respectively, who were last seen returning home from a get-together at a local yacht club in the Los Angeles suburb of Pomona on May 16, 1928. Their remains would later be found buried on the chicken farm. In the aftermath of their disappearances, the Winslow family had received letters, purportedly written by their sons, stating that they had decided to run away and see the world. Since they were so young, they hoped that their sudden vanishing act would make them famous someday. Their parents, who knew them better than anyone, weren't fooled by the phony correspondence. The boys were homebodies who seldom ventured far from their own backyard. They were convinced that if their sons had penned the letters, it had been at someone else's command. Sanford Clark revealed that there had been another victim, a Mexican child whose name he did not know. He couldn't say how he came to be at the farm, but he had witnessed his uncle torturing and decapitating the boy. After committing the egregious act, Northcott had ordered his nephew to dispose of the head, which he accomplished by first burning it and then crushing what remained into a pulp. While Sanford was getting rid of evidence at the farmhouse, Northcott had loaded the boy's body into his vehicle and driven it out to La Puente where he dumped it along the interstate. Investigators would later identify the boy as Alvin Gahi, who had been missing since January or February of 1928. When all of their ducks were in a row, prosecutors charged Northcott with 3 counts of murder. He wasn't held accountable for the death of Walter Collins due to the fact that his mother's confession, which she would later recant, had exonerated him. Initially, Gordon Northcott had admitted to murdering 5 boys in cold blood. By the time his trial rolled around, he had taken a cue from his mother and denied having any involvement in the killings. Despite his sudden about-face, the case against him was strong enough to move forward, with or without his confession. Even though the evidence showed that he was responsible for killing at least 3 boys, the state felt that the number was probably closer to 20, though they couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Arrogant to the core, Northcott had always lived his life under the assumption that he was the smartest person in the room. As such, when he finally had his day in court, he insisted on acting as his attorney. One high point of his bizarre performance came when he called his mother to the stand to reiterate to the jury that she would do anything in her power to protect her son. In the coming days, evidence was presented suggesting that dozens of boys had been picked up and brought to the farm over the years. Most were abused in every conceivable way before being dropped off in the areas from which they had been abducted. Before releasing his victims, Northcott would warn them that he knew where they lived and would kill them, and their families if they uttered a word to anyone about what had happened. His threats had apparently been effective since none of the boys had reported the brutal incidents until after their assailant was safely behind bars. The children he had chosen to keep had all been dispatched with the blunt end of an axe. It was theorized that these boys were sacrificed simply because they had put up more of a fight than the others, leading their captor to believe that they wouldn't keep quiet if he allowed them to go free. It was revealed at trial that Northcott and his mother had moved most of their victims' remains to a remote area in the desert when they got wind that the law was onto them. This explained why only partial remains were found at the site. On February 5, 1929, the jury found Gordon Northcott guilty of the murders of Louis Winthrop, Nelson Winthrop, and Alvin Gahi. The punishment they handed down was death by hanging. On October 2, 1930, Northcott was marched to the gallows at San Quentin State Prison where the executioner waited patiently to carry out his duties. At the age of 23, the soulless killer whose only regret had been getting caught, was sent to meet his maker at the end of a noose. Northcott's mother Sarah ended up serving 12 years for the murder of Walter Collins, whose body was never recovered. She would die of natural causes in 1944. Sanford Clark spent 2 years in a youth correctional facility for his role in the murders. A child himself at the time of the atrocities, the court determined that he had not been a willing accomplice, but rather had acted under duress. In many ways, he had been a victim much like the others, only he lived to tell the tale. After his release from the detention center, Sanford returned to Canada where he would go on to marry and raise a family of his own. By all accounts, he led an exemplary life that was in stark contrast to his troubled youth. In 1930, Christine Collins sued Los Angeles Police Captain J.J. Jones for $10,300. Although she wanted judgment against him, he refused to pay a dime to the grieving mother he had sent to a psychiatric hospital for daring to question his authority. While the ruling had resulted in his being suspended from the force pending an investigation into his mishandling of the Walter Collins case, he was reinstated after being cleared of any wrongdoing. Despite the fact that the trials were over, things would never be the same in the community of Wineville. Once known for its scenic landscapes and plush greenery, the area was now infamous for being the former home of a notorious child murderer. Though Northcott's chicken farm was long gone, the bitter memories still lingered. In 1930, in an effort to bury the past and begin anew, the town officially changed its name to Mira Loma, which means Hillview. Having distanced themselves from Wineville, and everything it represented, the people of Mira Loma were finally able to put their demons to rest. In the chilling world of true crime, few stories are as unsettling as that of Robert Hansen, the infamous Alaskan serial killer. This tale begins on a cold September 12, 1982, when two off-duty Alaska police officers stumbled upon a gruesome discovery while hunting in a remote area, 20 miles from Anchorage. This isolated region, accessible only by plane or boat, was typically frequented by serious hunters. As the officers made their way back to camp, they spotted a boot sticking out of the sand on the Kinnick River sandbar. To their horror, they realized it contained a human leg bone. Respecting the sanctity of a potential crime scene, the officers marked the location on their map and promptly reported their findings to their department. The next day, crime scene technicians unearthed the remains, discovering the victim still wore women's clothing. A single .223 caliber shell casing, a common hunting rifle ammunition, was found nearby. The body, sent for an autopsy, revealed the victim was a female who had died from 3 gunshot wounds, likely at least 6 months earlier. Chillingly, there were no bullet holes in her clothing, suggesting she had been shot while undressed and then redressed by her killer. A hospital bandage found in her clothing hinted she might have been blindfolded before her execution. Weeks later, dental records identified the victim as 23-year-old Sherry Morrow, an exotic dancer from Anchorage who had been missing for 10 months. Her last known whereabouts were unlocked to a photo shoot with a supposed professional photographer offering $300. The police suspected this photographer was her killer, but with no evidence besides a common shell casing, they were at a standstill. In a press conference, reporters questioned if Sherry's death was linked to other unsolved cases in the area. 2 years prior, 2 more women's bodies had been found nearby. One was too decomposed to identify, likely in her late teens or early 20s. The other, 24-year-old Joanne Messina, is also an exotic dancer from Anchorage. Despite their suspicions of a serial killer, police had no evidence to publicly confirm it. Over the next year, as more exotic dancers and prostitutes went missing, the police had no new leads until June 13, 1983. That morning, a man driving along the quiet Anchorage highway saw a young woman, pantsless and handcuffed, frantically waving for help. He stopped, let her into his car, and drove her to a nearby motel. The motel receptionist called the police, who arrived shortly after to find a terrified 17-year-old Cindy Paulson. Her harrowing story of abduction, assault, and escape was both detailed and horrifying. Cindy recounted how a wiry, bearded man with glasses had kidnapped her at gunpoint, taken her to his house, chained her in the basement, and assaulted her. After showing her his hunting trophies, he drove her to a small airport, intending to fly her to his remote cabin. Seizing an opportunity, Cindy escaped and flagged down the truck driver who saved her. Police were initially skeptical, but Cindy's detailed account convinced them. She even led them to the airport, identifying the hangar and the plane her captor had used. The plane's registration led them to Robert Hansen, a respected local baker with a passion for hunting. Hansen's house matched Cindy's description, and his alibi, corroborated by 2 friends, seemed solid. Cindy's refusal to take a lie detector test and subsequent disappearance further complicated the case. 3 months later, on September 2nd, construction workers uncovered another body near the previous sites. The remains were identified as 17-year-old Paula Golding, an exotic dancer missing for 5 months. Another .223 caliber shell casing found at the scene linked her murder to Sherry's. With the FBI's involvement, a profile of the killer pointed squarely at Hansen. Armed with this profile and new evidence, including a hunting map marked with 37 X's and a stash of women's jewelry, police arrested Hansen. A neighbor revealed that Hansen's alibi had been a lie, sealing his fate. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Hansen confessed, but only to the murders of the 4 women whose bodies had been found. He described his methodical approach, selecting young, vulnerable women, luring them with promises of money and modeling opportunities, and then abducting them at gunpoint. He would fly them to his remote cabin, release them into the wilderness, and then hunt them down like animals. Hansen's confession led to the discovery of 8 additional victims, but many more are believed to have perished at his hands. Authorities suspect that the 37 X's on Hansen's map marked the graves of his victims, but only 17 bodies were ever confirmed. On the night of June 12, 1983, Cindy Paulson was working the streets of Anchorage when a car pulled up beside her. Inside was a wiry, bearded man wearing glasses who seemed harmless enough. He offered to pay for her services, and she agreed. As soon as she got into the car, the man handcuffed one of her wrists and drew a gun, warning her to stay quiet. He then drove her to his house in a seemingly respectable neighborhood. Once inside, Cindy was led to the basement, where she was chained to the ceiling. For hours, her captor assaulted her. He then told her he would take her to his cabin in the woods and leave her alone in the basement. Terrified, Cindy waited, praying for a chance to escape. When her captor returned, he took Cindy upstairs and proudly showed off his hunting trophies. It was then that she realized he had no intention of letting her go. He had shown her his face, his house, and his car, and told her about places he liked to go. Cindy knew she had to escape or she would be killed. The man drove Cindy to a small airport, where he claimed his plane was parked. As he loaded the plane with guns and supplies, Cindy saw her chance. She bolted from the cockpit, ran out of the hangar, and disappeared into the nearby woods. Her captor chased her, screaming threats, but she managed to reach the highway and flag down a truck driver, who took her to safety. When the police arrived, Cindy was able to identify the hangar and the plane. The registration led them to Robert Hansen, a well-known baker in Anchorage. Despite Cindy's detailed account, Hansen's alibi seemed unshakable, and her refusal to take a lie detector test left the police with doubts. On September 2, 1983, construction workers found another body near the previous sites. This time, the remains belonged to 17-year-old Paula Golding, another exotic dancer who had gone missing months earlier. A .223 caliber shell casing found at the scene matched the one found near Sherry Morrow. The police now knew they were dealing with a serial killer. The FBI's involvement brought in a profiler, John Douglas, whose profile of the killer matched Hansen perfectly, a man in his 40s, well-liked, an avid hunter, and likely having a speech defect. This profile, combined with the evidence from Cindy and the new findings, led to a search warrant for Hansen's home. During the search, authorities found a hunting map with 37 X's marked, some coinciding with the locations of the known victims. They also discovered a .223 caliber rifle and a stash of women's jewelry, including a necklace that belonged to Sherry Morrow. A neighbor's revelation that Hansen's alibi had been falsified sealed his fate. Confronted with the evidence, Hansen confessed, but only to the murders of the 4 women whose bodies had been found. His method was chilling. He would lure women with promises of money and modeling opportunities, abduct them, fly them to his remote cabin, and release them into the wilderness to hunt them down. Hansen's confession revealed a methodical and horrifying pattern. He would drive around Anchorage at night, looking for young, vulnerable women. Once he found a target, he would approach them, often posing as a professional photographer. Many of these women, aspiring models, were eager to accept his offers of money for a photo shoot. Hansen would arrange to meet them the next day at a public location, typically a fast food restaurant. He would arrive early, watching to ensure they were alone. If they were, he would drive up, ask them to get in his car, and once inside, handcuff them, draw his gun, and take them to his house. In his basement, Hansen would chain his victims to the ceiling and assault them for hours. He would then drive them to his plane and fly them to his remote cabin. There, he would release them into the wilderness, giving them a false sense of hope before hunting them down like animals. Hansen's arrest and confession led to the discovery of additional victims, but many more are believed to have perished at his hands. Authorities suspect that the 37 X's on Hansen's map marked the graves of his victims, but only 17 bodies were ever confirmed. Robert Hansen died in prison in 2014, taking the full extent of his gruesome secrets to the grave. His horrific legacy serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind a seemingly ordinary facade. We delve into the twisted psyche of a man who terrorized Italy during the 1990s, leaving a trail of fear and destruction in his wake. We embark on a journey into the depths of human depravity, exploring the chilling tale of one of Italy's most infamous serial killers. Donato Bilancia's name became synonymous with fear and terror during the 1990s, as he embarked on a relentless spree of violence that shocked the nation. Join us as we unravel the enigma of Bilancia's life and crimes, seeking to understand the motivations behind his heinous acts and the impact they left on society. In the late 1990s, one of Italy's bloodiest serial killers was roaming around Genoa. His period of activity was short but at the same time long and complex, marked by changes in motive and modus operandi. His murderous violence exploded in those few months with all the fury repressed for decades. Donato Bilancia was born in 1951 and spent his childhood in Genoa with his parents and brother. From an early age, he endured the anguish of his abusive father, who lost no opportunity to debase him in front of anyone. His discomfort soon resulted in nocturnal enuresis, which lasted until Donato's pre-adolescence and was the cause of further humiliation and mistreatment by both his parents. Although little Donato suffered greatly from this abuse, he had good grades in school. But even this changed when he went from elementary to middle school. His grades and conduct gradually deteriorated, and he began hanging out with a group of boys who taught him the basics of thieving. For Donato, it was the beginning of an authentic obsession with money, which would accompany him for years. By now, relations with his parents had completely deteriorated. Although the physical abuse persisted, Donato continued on his chosen path. He also stole money from his parents and then spent it on prostitutes and gambling. To detach himself even more from his family, he began to call himself Walter instead of Donato. Once he finished middle school, he began earning a living with odd jobs and became increasingly involved in thievery. At the age of 16, Donato stole a car to resell the car radio, but the police discovered and arrested him. Because he was a minor and had a clean record, the court sent him to a correctional institution instead of prison. This punishment did more harm than good, as it allowed him to come into contact with other young criminals and convinced him once again to continue on that path. 2 years later, he was caught again after trying to steal from a church, and this time he ended up in prison. This arrest was only the first in a long series. In the following years, the same pattern continued to repeat itself. Bilancia would get out of jail, start stealing again, lose most of the loot in some underground gambling den, and after a while, the police would arrest him again. The turning point for him came around 1984 when he met a professional thief who taught him his secrets. After this meeting, Donato carried out high-profile and much more profitable burglaries. Suddenly he found himself flush with money, so much so that he could easily cover his continuing debts to gambling house owners. But his fortunate period ended abruptly in 1987 when a series of misfortunes marked him deeply. His brother Michel, who had just separated from his wife, committed suicide by throwing himself under a train, taking his 4-year-old son with him. 3 years later, Donato had a serious car accident that put him in a coma for 5 days. These events caused him severe trauma and filled him with anger, which Bilancia tried to suppress by continuing his life of theft, gambling, and paid sex. This went on until 1997, when his fury eventually exploded. Donato Bilancia was not good at making friends. Many people gravitated to him because he was always flush with money, and he tended to reciprocate every little favor exaggeratedly to compensate for his low self-esteem. Those he called fraternal friends often became profiteers, but some lasted longer than others. And none had lasted longer than Maurizio Parenti. One evening, Maurizio asked Donato to accompany him to a gambling den where he worked as a bouncer. Once there, Bilancia began to play and won a massive sum of money. Galvanized by this success, he became a regular at the gambling house, but after the first night, he began to lose big. Soon after, he discovered by accident that he had been cheated. Maurizio, in agreement with gambling house owner Giorgio Centenaro, had lured his friend into the den so that he would lose all his money. Donato Bilancia had ignored his traumas for 10 years, but this latest shock triggered in him all the pain he had managed to suppress until then. After crying all night, anger prevailed, and he decided to make them pay dearly. Donato discovered where Giorgio Centenaro lived, and on the evening of October 14, 1997, he went to wait for him under his house. When Centenaro arrived, Bilancia accompanied him to his apartment and threatened him with a gun. He had no intention of shooting him because he feared the neighbors would hear the noise. Instead, he ordered Centenaro to take off all his clothes except his underwear, bound him with duct tape, and used his hands to plug his nose and mouth. He allowed him to breathe every now and then as he told him why he was killing him. Finally, he suffocated him with duct tape. Before he left, Bilancia removed the tape from the body to leave no clues but left the body in an unnatural position so that people would know Centenaro had been killed. There was a lot of money in the house, but he left without touching it. He hadn't come there for that. 10 days later came Maurizio Parenti's turn. This time, too, Bilancia waited for him under his house and managed to enter his apartment on a pretext. He used the same modus operandi, threatening Maurizio with a gun and immobilizing him. Unfortunately, he had not anticipated that Carla Scotto, Mauricio's wife, was also in the house. Bilancia emptied the couple's safe to simulate a robbery, then took them into the bedroom and shot them both. By now, he had accomplished his revenge, but from that moment on, he would not be able to stop. After only 3 days, Donato killed another couple, Bruno Solari and Maria Lucia Pitto, owners of a goldsmith shop. He entered their store to rob them, but the couple blindly ran away, and he shot them both. Almost a month passed, and Bilancia found himself short of money, so he decided to rob Luciano Mauro, a money changer who lived in the nearby town of Ventimiglia. On November 13th, he sneaked into his house, stole 45 million lire, 32,000 euros today, and killed Mauro so he would not testify against him. This was his last murder with a clear motive. From then on, Donato Bilancia would kill to satisfy a murderous impulse. Bilancia would never be able to explain what motives prompted him to kill his next victim. It was a Genoese night watchman named Giorgio Canu. The killer chose him out of so many people because he seemed the easiest victim. He followed him for a few nights to know his movements, then shot him on the evening of January 25th. After being inactive for a month, he struck 5 times in March 1998, moving to different locations in the Liguria region. Because he didn't have his own method for choosing his victims, he began to target the easiest victims, prostitutes. He usually approached them by passing for a client, took them to isolated places, and then killed them. In this way, he murdered 3 girls, Albanian Stella Tria on March 9th, Ukrainian Ljudmila Zubskova on March 18th, and Nigerian Tessia Dodo on March 29th. He also committed another robbery homicide. On March 20th, he robbed and killed Enzo Gorni, a money changer, with the same modus operandi he had used on Mr. and Mrs. Solari. On the evening of March 24th, Bilancia picked up another prostitute named Lorena Castro in his car. He parked in front of a villa pretending to be the owner, then positioned the vehicle against a tree to block the door on the passenger side. Lorena barely had time to realize what was happening when suddenly 2 night watchmen appeared, Massimiliano Gualillo and Candido Rando. Bilancia tried to pretend to be the owner, but Lorena denied him and said he wanted to use violence on her. The 2 men wanted to call the station, so he shot them dead. Meanwhile, Lorena had gotten out of the car and hid behind a bush. Bilancia shot her in the abdomen, but the shot wasn't fatal. Not only did Lorena save herself, but she was able to provide the police with a sketch of the prostitute killer that would later prove crucial. A few days later, Bilancia responded to the advertisement of Luisa Simonelli, a prostitute working from home in San Remo. He went to her apartment and put a gun to her head as soon as they were alone. Terrified, Luisa took a photo of a little child from the bedside table and showed it to the killer. She told him that the child was her son, that his father had abandoned them, and that without his mother, he would be alone in the world. The child in the photo was actually Luisa's nephew, but Bilancia believed her story and left without killing her. Later, her testimony would also be vital for his indictment. Until the end of March, no one had yet connected all the murders committed by Donato Bilancia, partly because his pattern had changed several times from October to March. Only after Tessia Dodo's death did ballistics manage to establish that the same gun had killed the young prostitutes and the 2 guardsmen. Reports began to circulate that a serial killer was on the loose in Liguria. But police still had no clues as to who the killer was or how many people he had killed. In April, Donato Bilancia again changed the pattern of his murders, but this time he alarmed the masses. On April 12th, he boarded a train bound for Venice and saw a young woman alone in a compartment. Her name was Elisabetta Zappetti, and she worked as a nurse in a hospital in Milan. Bilancia waited in the corridor for her to get up to go to the bathroom, followed her, and opened the door with a false key. Elisabetta immediately started screaming, but Bilancia was faster. He put her jacket over her head and shot her. It was Easter Sunday, so the train was deserted, and no one noticed anything. Bilancia got off at the next stop, and shortly afterward, a conductor found Elisabetta's body. This murder triggered a collective psychosis. Unlike prostitutes, this victim had been chosen at random, in broad daylight, in a safe setting. This meant that the killer didn't target a specific group of people. Anyone could have been next. Over the next week, Bilancia committed 2 more murders. On the evening of April 14th, he killed another prostitute, Cristina Valla, while on April 18th, he again went hunting on trains. This time his victim was Maria Angela Rubino, who was shot to death in the train bathroom, as was Elisabetta Zapetti. This time, before getting off the train, Bilancia masturbated and then wiped his hand on her shoulder. The last murder occurred on April 20th, at a service station on the highway between Genoa and Ventimiglia. Bilancia filled up his car, then asked gas station attendant Giuseppe Melito for credit until the next day. The man became angry and demanded to have his money immediately. Irritated, Bilancia pulled out his gun and robbed him, then fired all his bullets at him and drove away. Throughout the murders, Donato Bilancia had always moved around in his car, a black Mercedes. He had bought the car from a friend of his but had never made the transfer of ownership. And because he never paid highway tolls, his friend received an impressive number of fines, so much so that he eventually decided to file a complaint. Upon close examination, the fine showed a correspondence between the murders committed in recent months and the Mercedes movements. Meanwhile, some of Bilancia's acquaintances had begun to suspect that he was behind the murders, especially after the sketch was released. Therefore, the police decided to investigate further and put Donato Bilancia under surveillance. 2 undercover policemen followed Bilancia to a coffee shop one day and observed him drinking coffee. When he was gone, they took a sample of his DNA. Forensics found a match with semen found at Maria Angela Rubino's murder scene. Donato Bilancia was finally arrested on May 6, 1998. He confessed to all the crimes, even those that no one had thought to link to him. Police later examined his gun and connected it to the crimes through gunpowder analysis. The trial began in May 1999. Bilancia was sentenced to 13 life sentences for the 17 murders and 16 years in prison for the attempted murder of Lorena Castro. The court also stipulated that the first 3 years of his imprisonment would be solitary confinement. Those 3 years would become 11 because Bilancia received constant death threats from other inmates. He spent most of his detention in Padua prison. Considered extremely dangerous, he never received any sentence reduction. Only once, in 2017, did he get permission to leave jail under escort to visit his father's grave. Over the next 2 years, he applied for the right to some supervised releases, but each request was denied. In December 2020, Bilancia tested positive for COVID-19 and was admitted to Padua Hospital. When his health condition deteriorated, he decided to refuse treatment. 2 weeks later, on December 17, he died in the hospital at the age of 69. The German serial killer who killed, raped, butchered, and cannibalized young men. Friedrich Heinrich Karl Fritz Haarmann became infamously known as the Butcher of Hanover after committing a series of murders of over 24 young males. For almost 6 years, Friedrich served as a police informant, which made him an unlikely suspect as he hunted down and killed his victims. While he confessed to nearly 30 murders, he was suspected to have been responsible for a lot more. Friedrich Haarmann was born in Hanover, Germany on October 25, 1879. He was the 6th child of Ollie and Johanna Haarmann, a poor couple who struggled to make ends meet for their large family. As a child, Friedrich seemed to display more feminine characteristics than a typical boy of his age. He also displayed some sadistic tendencies, which involved him tying his sisters up and scaring them, and threatening to report his father to the police for having murdered a train driver. Friedrich was not the best student either. He was forced to attend a military academy after regular school did not work out for him, and even though he performed academically well there, he was discharged for medical reasons. Once he returned to Hanover, he found work at a local cigar factory. In 1898, Friedrich was accused of sexually abusing young children, but was deemed psychologically impaired and therefore could not stand trial. Instead, he was sent away to a mental institution for rehabilitation. 6 months later, he managed to escape from the asylum. He hid in Switzerland for a year before finally returning to his homeland. In 1900, he married Erna Loert and had a child with her. He abandoned his new family to pursue a life in the military. Friedrich proved to be a decent soldier. Late into 1901, however, he was diagnosed with an unspecified mental illness, due to which he was discharged and sent back to his family. Upon his return, his father attempted to have him admitted into an asylum again, but doctors refused to admit him. Friedrich attempted to lead a normal life by opening up a small business, but that collapsed almost instantly. Not long after that, he began to engage in small crimes like burglaries and con jobs. He was incarcerated often and gained a reputation with the Hanover police. Following one of his releases, he decided to become an informant for the police so he could drive attention away from himself. At the same time, he had also begun to engage in sexual offenses, which went unfiled with the police because the victims did not come forward. On September 25, 1918, Friedrich committed his first murder. The victim was a 17-year-old boy named Friedel Roth. Reports from eyewitnesses and pressure from Roth's friends and family led to the authorities raiding Friedrich's residence, where they found him sharing a bed with a 13-year-old boy. However, Roth was nowhere to be found in the vicinity. Friedrich was immediately placed under arrest for sexual assault, but for unknown reasons, his house was never searched and he was cleared of all charges not long after the arrest. When he was interrogated much later, he revealed that if police had searched his home at the time, they would have found Roth's severed head behind the stove. Upon his release, Friedrich met up with Hans Kranz, a man with whom he became romantically involved shortly after their meeting. In 1922, the two moved into an apartment together, which was when Friedrich resumed his killings. Kranz ended up becoming his partner's accomplice after returning home one day to Friedrich in the process of murdering 17-year-old Fritz Frank. Over the next 9 months, 12 other young men were robbed and killed by Friedrich, and their remains were thrown into the Leine River. For a long time, the murders went unnoticed. More than 500 human bones were found along the bank of the river Leine as of May 1924. The murders were connected to the same killer whom the citizens of Hanover dubbed as the Butcher of Hanover. However, there was no evidence to tie them to Friedrich yet. 17-year-old Erich de Vries was Friedrich's final victim. The police launched a manhunt for the killer responsible for all the previous murders and suspected Friedrich after records of his molestation in 1898 surfaced. The authorities proceeded to silently monitor Friedrich and finally arrested him after catching him trying to seduce a potential victim, Karl Frum. Frum had spent a few days in Friedrich's apartment before and had been sexually assaulted by him. When questioned, Friedrich revealed that he intended to kill Frum. Once they had taken Friedrich into their custody, police entered his home to search for evidence. They came across blood-stained walls and the clothes and belongings of the victims scattered around the residence. Friedrich confessed to the murders, claiming to have killed somewhere between 50 and 60 people. Official records, however, showed his body count to be somewhere between 24 and 27 individuals. Friedrich proceeded to help officers locate his victims at different sites along the river where he had dumped them. He was rather cooperative throughout the investigation but refused to converse with his victims' families. When talking about the details of his murders, Friedrich said, "I'd make 2 cuts in the abdomen and put the intestines in a bucket, then soak up the blood and crush the bones until the shoulders broke. Now I could get the heart, lungs, and kidneys, chop them up, and put them in my bucket. I'd take the flesh off the bones and put it in my waxcloth bag. It would take me 5 or 6 trips to take everything and throw it down the toilet or into the river. I always hated doing this, but I couldn't help it. My passion was so much stronger than the horror of the cutting and chopping." An analysis of his victims and modus operandi revealed that he targeted young male runaways and commuters, many of whom were prostitutes. All of his victims were lured in from Hanover's Central Station. He would lure them in by offering them food and beverages, and once they entered his home, he would bite through their throats to kill them. In some instances, he stated that he drank their blood and sodomized them, before dismembering them and tossing their parts into the Leine River. He ground the flesh of many of his victims and sold it as beef or pork. He either kept their belongings for himself or sold them for cash on the black market. On December 4, 1924, Friedrich Hermann's trial was conducted at the Hanover Assizes. Most people would describe him as a vampire or a werewolf, mostly because the term serial killer was not popular yet. During the trial, he accused Kranz of many of the murders, and the court ended up believing him. The court was especially shocked to discover that Friedrich had been a police informant, which was primarily why he had avoided suspicion for so long. During the 2 weeks of the trial, 200 witnesses presented their accounts. In the end, Friedrich Hermann, the Butcher of Hanover, was found guilty of the murder of all but 3 of the victims whom authorities had connected to him. He was given the death penalty by guillotine. Kranz, on the other hand, was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The remains of Friedrich's victims were laid to rest at Stockener Cemetery a few months before his execution, and a memorial with their names and ages was erected in April 1928. He was executed on April 15, 1925. His last words were, "I repent, but I do not fear death." His head was preserved for the purposes of scientific study until 2014 when it was cremated. Dennis Nilsen, a Scottish serial murderer and necrophile, murdered over a dozen people in London in 1978. A plumber by the name of Michael Catran was called to an apartment complex at 23 Cranley Gardens in North London on February 8, 1983, because drains had been clogged for some time. He never anticipated coming upon human remains. Catran started to remove the obstruction after opening a drain cover at the side of the structure. However, he found a flesh-like material and a few fractured bones instead of the usual jumble of hair or napkins. "It appears like someone has been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken," said one of the building's inhabitants, Dennis Nilsen. However, Catran believed it had an unsettlingly human appearance. He was right, it turned out. And Nilsen alone was responsible for this terrible catastrophe. At least 12 adolescents and men were murdered by Dennis Nilsen between 1978 and 1983, and his victims' corpses were subjected to heinous acts. The Scottish serial murderer left behind several terrifying audio tapes that documented his killings in gory detail, further aggravating an already horrible situation. Dennis Nilsen, who was born in Fraserburgh, Scotland, on November 23, 1945, had a challenging childhood. He was crushed by his adored grandfather's passing and his parents' unhappy marriage. Nilsen also became aware of his sexual orientation at a young age, and he struggled much with it. At the age of 16, he decided to enlist in the army, where he served as a chef and, horrifyingly, a butcher. He pursued a career as a police officer when he departed in 1972. He wasn't a cop for very long, but he was there long enough for him to have a macabre obsession with corpses and examinations. Nilsen thereafter went on to work as a recruiter and lived with another guy for 2 years. Even though the guy later denied having a sexual connection with Nilsen, it was obvious that his departure in 1977 devastated Nilsen. But every time a new partner departed, he felt abandoned. He started to deliberately seek out sexual experiences. Nilsen decided to force the guys to remain by murdering them. He said that despite his desire to kill, after carrying out the deed he had second thoughts. According to Dennis Nilsen, the sensation of loss and anguish was stronger the more beautiful the man was. He was attracted by their naked corpses, but he would have given anything to have them alive now. A 14-year-old kid whom Dennis Nilsen had met at a bar the day before New Year's Eve in 1978 became his first victim. After Nilsen assured the child that he would provide him with booze for the evening, the boy accompanied him back to his flat. The young man eventually slept off after drinking with him. Nilsen strangled the child with a necktie and drowned him in a pail of water out of fear that he would run away if he woke. After cleaning the boy's body, he brought it into his bedroom with him. There, he tried performing a sex act on the corpse before just drifting off to sleep next to it. The boy's body was eventually buried under the floorboards of Nilsen's flat. Dennis would leave him there for several months before burying him in the backyard. Nilsen carried on seeking more victims in the meanwhile. Others were visitors who happened to be in the wrong pub at the wrong hour. Some of the youngsters and young men who were homeless or sex workers. Nilsen attributed his terrible impulse to keep them all to himself from his loneliness, but regardless of who they were, he wanted to keep them all to himself forever. Nilsen had resided in an apartment complex with a garden before relocating to 23 Cranley Gardens. He had first been burying bodies beneath his floorboards. But finally, the scent got to be too much. So he began disposing of his victims in the garden by burying, burning, and disposing of them. Dennis removed the victims from their hiding places, dissected them on the ground, and frequently preserved their skin and bones for later use, thinking that the scent was only coming from the internal organs. In addition to keeping a large number of the dead, he frequently dressed them up, put them to bed, watched TV with them, and engaged in heinous sex practices with them. And to make matters worse, he then rationalized this troubling conduct by saying, "A body is a thing. It cannot sense or endure pain. Your values are upside down if you're more concerned about what I did to a corpse than what I did to a live person." Nilsen would frequently make little bonfires in his backyard to get rid of the body parts he didn't want to preserve, discreetly throwing human organs and guts to the flames along with tire components to mask the scent. Near the fire pit, the body parts that weren't burned were buried. But at his new residence, these disposal strategies wouldn't be practical. Nilsen had to relocate since, regrettably, his landlord chose to rebuild his apartment in 1981. Nilsen had to be a little more inventive with his disposal techniques as 23 Cranley Gardens didn't have enough outdoor area for him to covertly burn body pieces. Nilsen started flushing human parts down his toilet, hoping that the flesh would either rot or sink deep enough into the sewers that it wouldn't be discovered. However, the building's plumbing was outdated and not nearly capable of disposing of people. It became so clogged that other residents also became aware of it and called a plumber. The human remains were quickly identified as coming from Nilsen's flat after an extensive analysis of the apartment building's pipes. The officers entered the room and instantly detected the smell of decomposition and rotting flesh. Nilsen casually led them to the garbage bag of body parts he kept in his closet when they inquired about where the remainder of the corpse was. Nilsen was positively identified as a suspect in many homicide cases after a second search uncovered body parts hidden throughout his residence. Although he acknowledged killing between 12 and 15 people, he insisted he couldn't recall the precise number. He was legally charged with 6 charges of murder and 2 attempted murders. In 1983, he was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment, where he translated most of his literature books into Braille. Nilsen did not show regret for his actions or a wish to be set free. Dennis Nilsen acquired more popularity in the early 1990s when he made a statement on the capture of American serial murderer Jeffrey Dahmer, who also preyed on youths and young men. However, Dahmer quickly garnered such notoriety that Nilsen finally earned the moniker British Jeffrey Dahmer, even though he was apprehended years before the real Dahmer. Nilsen and Dahmer had numerous traits outside their preference for killing men, such as their ways of strangling victims, engaging in necrophilia on their corpses, and dissecting the bodies. Once Dahmer was taken into custody, Nilsen commented on his motivations and charged him with lying about his cannibalism. Nilsen stated that he was strictly a bacon and eggs man when questioned if he ever ate any of his victims. Dennis made a series of terrifying audio tapes detailing his killings when he was incarcerated at some time. After suffering a burst abdominal aortic aneurysm, Dennis Nilsen passed away in jail in 2018 at the age of 72. He passed away in his jail cell while lying in his filth. He was also said to be in excruciating agony.